Hello, this is Peter Knego. Thank you so much for joining me for my latest Decked, which covers the history of one of America's most beautiful ocean liners, the SS Constitution. I hope you enjoy it. When I shot this footage of the Constitution in December of 1994, I thought it would make a great before tribute with plans for the ship to undergo a major refit the following spring. As it turns out, those plans fizzled, and this would be the last footage I took of this splendid-looking ship, which now lies in a watery grave in the mid-Pacific. And now, here is the Constitution's story. In the years immediately after World War II, American Export Lines, up to that time a successful freighter operator, contracted for a pair of liners to be built at Bethlehem Steel's Quincy, Massachusetts shipyard. Hulls number 1618 and 1619 would be mid-sized, speedy, three-class vessels for the Sun Lane route from New York to Algeciras, Cannes, Genoa, and Naples. They were given patriotic names of Independence and Constitution, the latter taking her name from the historic warship that was nicknamed Old Ironsides. In many ways, they were larger, speedier versions of the P-2 troop transports that served heroically in World War II. Like the P-2s, they had dual sets of boilers and engines should one be flooded or disabled, and they had the highest safety and fire standards of their day. And should they have been summoned for war duty, they could each have carried up to 10,000 troops. Fortunately, that never came to pass. American Export hired the famed industrial architect Henry Dreyfuss to design these stunning new ships. Dreyfuss was already celebrated for a catalog of designs, from the streamlined 20th century locomotive to the General Electric steam iron and the Bell AT&T rotary desk phone. Later on, he would design the Polaroid SX70 camera. Dreyfuss gave them streamlined and curvaceous profiles topped with twin-domed funnels and terraced afterdecks that culminated in anachronistic counter sterns. Like a Jules Verne apparition, they were at the same time futuristic and charmingly old-fashioned. With furnishings by Raymond Loewy, their early renderings revealed an airy modern first class with an indoor-outdoor sea island club, a completely circular observation lounge, and 4 penthouse apartments with enclosed verandas and a bar decorated with ships and bottles. They would also boast stunning lidos with 2 large pools to rival their Italian line competition. On September 16, 1950, 3 months after the independence, Constitution was launched in a gala ceremony. Mrs. Josephine Bay, a distinguished member of American Export's Board of Directors and wife of the U.S. Ambassador to Norway, did the godmother's honors with a bottle of California wine. For the next 6 months, the Constitution was fitted out, and after a 2-month delay due to copper and brass shortages, she entered service on June 25, 1951. Both 683 by 89-foot ships measured 30,293 gross tons and carried 1,000 passengers in 3 classes. And with the service speed of 23 knots, they were the fastest American liners until the advent of the United States in 1952. In her early years, Constitution suffered from second sister status, having her thunder stolen by the Independents, but she soon would make up for that in spades. Of their 1,000 passengers, 295 were first class. Typically of that era, first class was situated midships and topsides, Originally the top deck, sports deck was one level above the bridge. On aft boat deck, a pair of slender terraces branched out over the first-class pool. The new liners even had custom Henry Dreyfuss designed aluminum deck chairs. Featuring what were initially described as the world's most humorously improbable fish mosaics by Max Spivak, the Pool Cafe and Sea Island Club were situated by the first-class pool on Sundeck. Throughout their careers, both ships were billed as modern American living at sea. With its serrated metallic dome, the first-class observation lounge had a large glass panel with insets of American flora and fauna by Emile Norman. Following the observation lounge on promenade deck, the Constitution Lounge was likened to a large living room in an American manor house. And at the far aft end of promenade deck, the colorful boat and bottle bar was accordingly decorated with ships and bottles. And finally, the first-class Riviera restaurant was located in the heart of the ship on A deck. There was a 21-page wine and liquor list in first class, along with menus that would rival those of today's most luxurious cruise ships. Named after early American war captains, 4 penthouse suites with private but enclosed verandas overlooking the sea were the ship's most luxurious accommodations. First-class staterooms had beds that folded into sofas by day, and far ahead of their time, all of the ship's cabins had individually controlled air conditioning and portholes with polarized glass. 375 cabin-class passengers had the midships aft portion of the ship with their own pool and lido. The cabin-class public spaces began on aft bridge deck with the Marine Lounge. The Barbary Tavern followed, overlooking the cabin-class Sunlane pool, and featured captain's chair seating as well as a sailing ship mural by Edward Lewandowski. And as with first class, the cabin-class Pioneer restaurant was down on A deck and featured a mural by Anton Refrigier. Like those in first class, all cabin-class staterooms had a private bathroom and beds that became sofas by day. And finally, 330 tourist-class passengers occupied the far aft end of the ship with a limited amount of deck space on the fantail. A pair of tourist-class public rooms on aft main deck included the Knego room and the Vulcan Bar. The tourist-class Bella Vista restaurant offered anything but a great view from its position near the steering gear on aft A deck. Tourist-class staterooms on the Constitution had en-suite hot and cold running water, but bathroom facilities were down the hall. They also had individually controlled air conditioning. Constitution had a kennel, a theater, and playrooms that were used by all 3 classes. Along with the superliner United States and her smaller consort America, the Independence and Constitution were considered America's finest Atlantic liners. In their heyday, the Indian Connie carried a who's who roster of celebrities, artists, politicians, and even religious leaders. Perhaps the most dedicated of Constitution's A-listers was model-turned-actress-turned-princess Grace Kelley, who actually brought 90 guests with her royal wedding party when she crossed to Monaco from New York on April 4, 1956. Another top model who graced the Constitution's decks in that high-style era was my very own mother, Rosalie Calvert, who spent an afternoon on board for a fashion shoot. In terms of fame and cultural status, Constitution eclipsed the Independence for the first time in January 1956 when the Bon Voyage episode of I Love Lucy aired. Wisely, American Export paid Desilu to use the Constitution as a backdrop to Lucy missing the ship and then being flown by helicopter to be lowered on board. Lucy would then get stuck in a porthole in the next episode. Building on the momentum of Lucy and Grace Kelley, Constitution gained even more cachet as the setting for the 1957 film An Affair to Remember, starring Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr. Stock footage of the ship is interspersed with convincing replicas of her Sea Island Club and first-class pool area. Considered one of the most romantic films ever made, it was shown aboard both ships in their final cruising years. In the beginning of 1959, with demand for crossings near its all-time high, both liners were slightly enlarged with the extension of their forward superstructures, increasing the first-class capacity by 100 guests. Soon after, they were joined by the tourist-class liner Atlantic, which had recently been converted from the cargo ship Badger Mariner. Unfortunately, that striking observation lounge and the forward portion of the enclosed promenade were surrendered to new cabins and suites. In exchange, solariums were added at the top of the ships, and a new first-class writing room and card room were installed. And all the public areas and even the accommodations were given more muted color schemes. Shortly after her refit on March 1, 1959, Constitution collided with the Norwegian tanker Jolanta near the Ambrose light vessel. Both ships were damaged, but no lives were lost. From 1960 on, the Indy and Connie were painted white and began to cruise more as the airplane took its toll on passenger loads. As the 1960s progressed, with rising operating costs and the advent of new purpose-built cruise ships, they eventually began to lose money. In December of 1968, Constitution was laid up at a Jacksonville, Florida shipyard, where she would remain until being purchased by Taiwanese shipping magnate C.Y. Tung, owner of Orient Overseas Lines, in 1974. Tung renamed her Oceanic Constitution and towed her to Hong Kong, where she would collect rust and dust for another 6 years. In the meantime, Tung and a group of investors formed American Hawaii Cruises in 1978 and managed to get the Oceanic Independence restored to American registry for 7-day cruises from Honolulu in 1980. She became such a success that the Constitution soon followed. As the Indy enjoyed new success in Hawaiian cruising, Constitution was sent to a Taiwanese shipyard for a complete overhaul of her public spaces, accommodations, and machinery. On April 20, 1982, bedecked in red, white, and blue bunting and streamers, the now one-class 750-passenger Constitution was christened by none other than Princess Grace of Monaco. On June 6th, she sailed off on her maiden voyage under the American Hawaii banner. With their open and expansive teak-lined sun decks, 2 pools, and solid American construction, the Indy and Connie were ideal for Hawaiian cruising and remained popular for the next decade. By the early 90s, however, although spotlessly maintained, they were in need of mechanical and cosmetic upgrading. Plans to refit both ships had been announced, but after the Independence's costly makeover in 1994, the Constitution's scheduled 1995 refit was postponed, then eventually canceled. As the Indy soldiered on solo, Connie sat at a Portland, Oregon shipyard rotting away. Eventually, she was stripped for spare parts for the Indy and finally sold for scrap. The Constitution never kept her appointment with the Indian cutter's torches. She rolled over while under tow in the early morning hours of November 17, 1997, sinking in deep water some 700 miles north of Hawaii. But thanks to her pop culture exploits, her legend will live on. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please hit like and subscribe, and stay tuned for Part 2, the Constitution Top to Bottom Decked Tour. Signing off with special thanks to historian and author Alan E. Jordan, whose book Saluting the Aloha Spirit is the definitive volume on both of these ships.